ABC General Hospital spoilers reveal that what happened at Pier 55 should have ended Cullum's story. Rocco's gunshot was not a calculated act of revenge, but a desperate, terrified move from a boy who saw Jason losing control of a deadly situation and did the only thing he believed could stop it. In another world, that bullet would have been the final answer. Instead, it became the beginning of something far more dangerous. Cullum did not die at the docks. He fell, he bled, he slipped toward death, but he survived long enough to be rushed to General Hospital, and that survival instantly turned one VO. The moment Cullum entered GH, the hospital stopped feeling like a place of rescue and started feeling like a battlefield hidden behind bright lights and clean walls. The staff moved with urgency, but underneath that urgency was fear. Everyone could sense that this was not just another trauma case. Cullum brought chaos with him, and the people around him were about to be dragged into it whether they wanted to be or not. Lucas found himself standing at the center of that storm. He was the surgeon available, the doctor expected to act, the man forced to put aside instinct and do what medicine demanded. But the cruelty of the situation began the instant he realized who was on his table. He was not being asked to save an innocent man. He was being asked to save someone whose survival could bring even more destruction to Port Charles. Lucas had spent years learning how to separate emotion from duty, but that separation had never been tested like this. He already felt worn down by the emotional wreckage building around him, by loss, by confusion, by the sense that too many lives in Port Charles were being shaped by violence and hidden agendas. Now he had to take all of that and bury it under surgical focus. So he scrubbed in, steadied his hands, and forced himself to treat Cullum like nothing more than a critical patient. The bullet had done terrible damage. Blood loss was severe. Time was closing in. Lucas and his team fought through one complication after another, and every second required more concentration, more discipline, more denial of the anger rising in him. He could not afford to think about what kind of man Cullum was. He could only think about keeping him alive. That was what made the entire situation so brutal. Lucas was saving a man he already felt should have answered for too much. Worse, while he was doing everything in his power to preserve Cullum's life, another tragedy was unfolding beyond those operating room doors. Marco's fate was moving toward disaster, and Lucas did not yet know that the man on his table could be tied to the very loss that was about to shatter him. The irony was savage. He was pouring his skill, his training, and his conscience into saving one life while another life, the one that truly mattered to him, was slipping away in pain and silence. The surgery became an exhausting fight. Every time it seemed that Cullum might stabilize, another threat emerged. Internal damage, falling pressure, the possibility that the body would simply give out before the repairs could hold. Lucas kept pushing, partly because he had no other choice, and partly because if he failed through hesitation, he would never forgive himself. That is the curse of men like Lucas. They still believe duty means something, even when duty feels like a trap. He could not let hatred make the decision for him, even though hatred kept trying to rise through every careful movement of his hands. Then the case took an even darker turn. Cullum's condition suggested that emergency surgery alone might not be enough. Just as the pressure reached its highest point, a new figure appeared, Cullum's brother. His arrival did not bring comfort, it brought suspicion. He was too calm, too composed, too controlled for a man supposedly watching his brother hover near death. He did not feel like a grieving relative rushing in on instinct. He felt like someone who had been waiting for the right moment to step into the room, and what he offered only deepened the unease. He was a match. He could donate. He could help save Cullum. On the surface, it looked like sacrifice. Underneath, it felt like strategy. Lucas noticed it immediately, though he could not yet explain why. There was something unsettling in the brother's restraint, in the way he studied the room, in the way his attention kept drifting back to Lucas himself. This was not the desperate emotion of family. This was calculation hidden behind composure. Yet the medical facts left Lucas trapped again. If the brother's donation could help keep Cullum alive, rejecting it would mean choosing death. Once more, duty backed him into a corner. Once more, the morally clean choice did not exist. So he moved forward, even as a cold instinct warned him that he was not just treating a patient anymore. He was being pulled into something larger. What Lucas could not fully see yet was that Cullum's brother had not come only to save family. He had come to protect a network of power, secrets, and unfinished vengeance. Cullum alive was more useful than Cullum dead. A dead man becomes a scandal. A living man becomes leverage, and Lucas, by saving him, was becoming part of that leverage. The brother understood this immediately. Lucas was emotionally exposed, professionally trapped, and morally vulnerable. He was the perfect point of pressure. Then came the blow that changed everything. The truth about Marco began to emerge, and when it finally reached Lucas, it did not feel like news. It felt like collapse. Marco had been stabbed. Marco was gone. In an instant, the operating room became a nightmare in memory. Every effort Lucas had made to keep Cullum alive now felt contaminated. Every decision became unbearable to revisit. Grief hit him first as numbness, then as rage so sharp it nearly made him unrecognizable to himself. Because now the question was no longer abstract. It was personal. What if the man he had just saved was connected to Marco's death? What if all his mercy, all his discipline, all his professionalism had been used to rescue the monster who had helped destroy his future? That was the moment Lucas truly became vulnerable. Cullum's brothers saw it at once. Instead of threatening Lucas directly, he did something far more dangerous. He offered sympathy. He spoke with measured concern, with the false gentleness of someone who understands exactly how grief can be shaped into weakness. He did not need to accuse anyone openly. He only needed to guide Lucas's pain in the right direction. He suggested that too many reckless people had turned Port Charles into a war zone. He implied that private vendettas had created public tragedy, and slowly he nudged Lucas toward the idea that Jason and Britt, with their explosive bond and their constant proximity to violence, had helped create the conditions for this disaster. That manipulation worked because Lucas was already conflicted. Britt and Jason's connection had grown into something intense, raw, and dangerous. There was real loyalty between them, but there was also chaos. Jason's instinct to handle threats through force kept pulling everyone around him deeper into darkness. Britt, for all her strength, refused to step away from that darkness. Together they had become the kind of pair who inspired fierce devotion and deep fear at the same time. Lucas could see that even before this tragedy. Now, under the weight of grief, the doubts became harder to control. He did not fully blame them, but he could no longer ignore how often disaster seemed to gather around them. That was exactly what Cullum and his brother needed. As Cullum slowly stabilized, the alliance between the brothers began to take shape in silence. It was not built on tenderness or family love, but on mutual survival and control. The brothers' donation was not a pure act of sacrifice. It was an investment in keeping Cullum alive long enough to continue whatever dark business still remained unfinished. And Cullum, even weak in a hospital bed, remained dangerous. In some ways, he became more dangerous there. He no longer needed brute force. He had pity on his side now, vulnerability on his side, the illusion of a wounded man struggling back from death. Behind that illusion, revenge was already taking form. Lucas could feel the trap tightening, even if he could not yet name every part of it. He felt watched, he felt studied. He felt as though every emotion inside him was being turned against him. His grief for Marco became guilt over saving Cullum. His anger at Cullum bled into frustration with Britt and Jason. His professional integrity started to feel less like honor and more like the very chain being used to drag him into someone else's nightmare. He hated that confusion most of all. Lucas was not corrupt, not cruel, not built for these games, but decent men are often the easiest to exploit because they still care enough to be wounded. And Lucas was wounded everywhere. He was angry at Cullum for surviving, angry at the brother for arriving too perfectly, too calmly, too usefully, angry at Jason for living in a world where violence never stayed contained, angry at Britt for staying close to that world no matter how dangerous it became, angry at the hospital for forcing morality to submit to procedure. Most of all, he was angry at himself, because no matter how many reasons he gave himself, one truth would not stop echoing in his mind. He had used his own hands to save a man who may have helped take Marco away from him forever. That thought poisoned everything. Even success felt disgusting. Every sign of Cullum's recovery felt like an insult. Every improvement in his condition felt like another betrayal of Marco's memory. There was no peace in having done the job well. There was only the sickening possibility that Lucas's best act as a doctor had become the worst mistake of his life. That inner collapse made him exactly what Cullum and his brother wanted him to become: isolated, unstable, and open to influence. Meanwhile, Jason understood that the danger had not ended at the pier. Cullum alive meant unfinished war. Britt could sense it too, and what made it worse was knowing that their own relationship now stood inside the line of fire. Their bond was real, but reality did not make it safe. If anything, it made it easier to weaponize. Lucas's pain, Rocco's trauma, Marco's death, Cullum's survival, the brothers' suspicious loyalty, all of it now pressed inward on the same fragile group of people. One wrong move, one revelation, one surge of rage from Lucas, and everything could fracture at once. That is what makes this chapter so dangerous. Not simply that Cullum survived a bullet to the back. Not simply that Lucas became the doctor who saved him. Not simply that a mysterious brother stepped forward with a donation that felt more like a bargain with darkness than an act of love. It is that every one of these events now feeds the same machine of grief, suspicion, and revenge. Lucas is no longer just a surgeon caught in a terrible case. He is becoming the emotional center of a much larger struggle, and Cullum knows it. His brother knows it. Jason and Britt are beginning to feel it. And if Lucas finally learns the full truth about Marco, then his sorrow may not remain sorrow for long. It may become something far more dangerous. Because in Port Charles, death is never the only weapon. Sometimes survival does far more damage. Lucas could not save Marco. That truth would not soften with time, would not become easier to carry, and would not stop tearing through him every time he closed his eyes. Marco was gone, and the loss did not settle inside Lucas as quiet grief. It erupted as fury, guilt, and a brutal kind of self-hatred that refused to let him breathe. What made it even worse, what made it almost impossible to endure, was the horrifying reality that while Marco was dying, Lucas had been fighting with everything he had to save Cullum. The wrong man lived. The wrong man was given another chance. And Lucas was the one who had made that happen. That realization changed something dark inside him. At first, Lucas tried to cling to reason, to the oath he had taken, to the belief that a doctor does not choose who deserves to survive. But grief destroyed that comfort almost instantly. The rules that once gave his life meaning now felt like chains wrapped around his throat. He had done his duty, and his duty had rewarded evil. He had used his own hands, his own skill, his own strength to pull a monster back from death, only to lose the man he could not bear to lose. There was no peace in that. There was no honor in it. There was only regret, violent and relentless, eating through every defense he had left. Now a new shift is beginning inside Lucas, and it is far more dangerous than sorrow. This is no longer just about mourning Marco, it is about revenge. The guilt of saving Cullum is turning into something explosive, because Lucas cannot escape the thought that he did more than fail Marco. He helped the enemy survive. He preserved the very source of his own destruction. That is the kind of regret that does not stay buried. It mutates, it sharpens, it begins to demand balance. Lucas is no longer looking at Cullum as a patient who happened to cross his path. He is looking at him as the living symbol of everything stolen from him. Every sign of Cullum's recovery feels like an insult. Every breath Cullum takes feels like proof that fate made a cruel mistake. And the more Lucas relives that terrible night, the more one unbearable question keeps poisoning his mind. If he had known the truth sooner, would he still have saved him? That question is the beginning of Lucas's unraveling, because once revenge enters his grief, nothing remains simple. His pain becomes a weapon pointed in every direction, at Cullum, at fate, at the hospital, and most of all at himself. He cannot bring Marco back, but he may start believing that making Cullum suffer is the only justice left. And if that need for vengeance keeps growing, Lucas may cross a line that even he never imagined he could approach. This is why the aftermath of Marco's death could become even more explosive. Lucas is not just heartbroken. He is humiliated by his own mercy, haunted by his own professionalism, and consumed by the unbearable knowledge that he saved the wrong life. If that regret fully ignites, then Lucas will not remain a grieving man for long. He will become a man who wants payback, and that kind of transformation could shake Port Charles to its core.